Hi, for joining us today for our first installment of Virtual with the Vet. Today we will be talking about heartworm. We were planning on having Dr. Kim join us today, but unfortunately it looks like he's unavailable, so I'm going to be filling in for him. I'm Jennifer Rosen, for those of you that don't know me, the Volunteer Programs Manager here at Michigan Humane, and it is my pleasure to share some more information that hopefully you guys will find useful either while you are volunteering on site and working with animals. If you are fostering, this is knowledge that you can use with your fosters or even your own personal pets. So looking forward to chatting more about heartworm with y'all. Ashley, thank you. So today we'll be talking about who the highest risk is for the illness, specifically heartworm, how heartworm disease is transmitted, how we can prevent it, and how volunteers can keep animals healthy. And then we'll open it up for some Q&A. But just as a reminder, if you have any questions throughout, you can go ahead and type those in the chat if you'd like, so that way you don't forget your question when we get to the end. So we'd like to start off with this little statement. We have been doing this now for a couple of our informational sessions that we're talking about health and safety of animals. And I think this is really important to bring up that we all have a responsibility to shelter animals, to keep them happy and as healthy as possible during their stay at Michigan Humane. It might look different for us, whether we're a staff member or a volunteer, but still we're all working to that same goal. We want to make sure that the animals are well, because when they're feeling better, they're showing better, they're probably getting out of the building and finding their new forever home as soon as they possibly can. So when we talk about high-risk populations, those are going to be animals that are defined as those who are the most susceptible to illness or disease. So specifically when we're talking about heartworm, those are going to be dogs. Technically, cats can get it too, but when we talk about heartworm's preferred host, that is going to be dogs, especially those that are living outdoors, and definitely if they are not on prevention. Also, canids can get them as well. So coyotes and other animals in the dog-like family, and this is where Dr. Kim probably could have given a little better information than me. But yeah, dogs are definitely going to be at risk if they are not on a prevention. So that's why it's important to us, because again, whether they're in the shelter or in our homes, they are at risk. Heartworm transmitted. There are some common misconceptions here that heartworm is contagious from dog to dog, and that is simply not true. The way that heartworm is transmitted is through mosquitoes. So what has to happen is a mosquito has to bite. In this little photo here, actually, if you want to go over the dog with the mosquito on top of it there. So what has to happen is the mosquito actually has to bite a dog that's already been infected with a disease. What happens is the microfilaria are running through, so those are not the full adult heartworms yet. They're running through the dog's blood system, and when the mosquito takes a yummy snack and has its dinner and sucks up that blood, the heartworm filaria actually get into the mosquito's body. Then what happens is the mosquito is going to fly and find another dog to bite. That's their new host. When they bite that dog, if they're not infected with heartworm, this is when that transmission is going to happen. Mosquito actually is going to make a little incision into their skin. The infected material that is carried on the mosquito is going to get into the dog's tissues and then eventually make its way into the bloodstream. When those microfilarias grow, they're actually going to eventually turn into adult heartworms. And that's when they're going to actually start growing and maturing in the heart. And that's when really the issues are caused, is when they turn into that big spaghetti that you can see that starts blocking up chambers or ventricles for the animal. So the unfortunate thing about heartworm is it has now been diagnosed in all 50 states. So heartworm is everywhere. We cannot avoid it. If we are in the United States, our dogs are potentially at risk. The other unfortunate thing about heartworm is even though it can be treated, it still causes lifelong changes to the heart. So once a dog has had heartworm, even though we might get rid of those adult heartworms and those microfilaria, if they've actually had those adults in their heart, usually those adults start doing damages and changes that are irreversible. The other really big thing that is unfortunate about heartworm is treatment for the disease. Once those adult worms start taking place and growing in the body, it's extremely expensive and time consuming to treat. It takes at least a couple of months to get the dog staged and prepped and ready to receive treatment. And then they need about 6 months of cage rest. So it's not an easy treatment. The drugs are also really tough on the dog, and some dogs won't actually survive heartworm treatment. So those are other things that are important to consider as well. So, what are the symptoms? How do we know if a dog actually has heartworm? And here's the real trouble with it is a lot of times you can't see heartworm until those adult worms start taking place. And even then, it might not be right away. A dog could be living with a heartworm infection for a while before we even begin to see symptoms. The most mild symptoms, like it says right there, they're asymptomatic. You don't know that those worms are in the bloodstream and starting to do damage to your dog. We might also see a mild cough. Again, a lot of us might not think anything of that. Occasionally, a cough here and there isn't really a cause for concern in our dog. When the symptoms become a little bit more moderate, we're going to see more frequent coughing, fatigue, and we're going to start to see weight loss in our pet. Still might not necessarily associate that right away if we're like haven't taken to the vet recently with something super serious, because weight loss can happen very slowly over time. And we could also think our dog just might be tired. We might not start putting it together right away. Severe, this is when heartworm treatment is the hardest and probably the most fatal to a dog, is when the symptoms have gotten so bad that we can clearly see them and we know something is wrong with our dog. That's constant fatigue, a persistent cough that doesn't seem to go away. They might have trouble or difficulty breathing. They might suddenly collapse because, again, there's not enough blood flow getting through their body, oxygen being pumped to those lungs. They might have a really round or extended belly, so the belly is super bloated and big and starting to hang down. And then the worst symptom, of course, where the disease is fatal. So those adult worms have really done so much damage in the body that they're not going to respond to treatment or might not make it through the treatment if we try. And sometimes dogs die before we've even diagnosed them. So let's talk about some facts and myths. A myth: you don't have to worry about heartworms in the winter. That's actually not true. If there's mosquitoes in the environment, there's a concern for heartworm. So we all live in Michigan, and it's February today, so this is still considered winter in Michigan, and we're having a really warm day. It's actually going to get close up to 60 degrees. That is warm enough for mosquitoes to be out in the environment. So because we live in a state where we have a really long season where it's not too cold for mosquitoes to be growing or breeding out in the environment, our dogs are at risk. So actually most DVMs will recommend heartworm prevention all 12 years for dogs that are living in this state. There's actually a lot of recommendations that they stay on heartworm prevention anyways, which we'll talk about a little bit further, but there are other benefits to being on prevention besides just protecting them from heartworm. And a lot of companies have guarantees as well if their pets stay on it. Another myth: you can treat heartworms with a dewormer. That's not true. Heartworms definitely require a very specific, very expensive, and definitely intensive treatment. Again, once those microfilaria have turned into adult worms, no longer is treatment simple. That's actually where heartworm prevention comes in, is they make sure all the microfilaria are killed in the bloodstream before they have the opportunity to turn into adult worms. Next myth: heartworm prevention is a waste of money. That's absolutely not true. It is so much cheaper to give your dog a monthly preventative, or now there are products like ProHeart Plus that is an injection either every 6 or 12 months that protect your dog all year round. Even though they can seem expensive because you're paying one amount cost up front, if you need to treat heartworm disease, that's actually going to be anywhere between $1,000 and $3,000 to treat a dog through heartworm disease. And there's no guarantee that one initial treatment, depending on how severe the infection is going to completely cure your dog. And remember, the effects of the disease to the heart, those are lifelong. Those are irreversible. We can never change those. So a myth: heartworm prevention is a waste of money. Heartworm prevention reduces the chance of heartworm disease and the need to treat them for it. So you're going to save money and you're going to protect your dogs.
Before you go, can I ask you a question?
I am on a meeting.
No, when you don't, before you go.
Preventing and managing outbreaks. So prevention is key. There are many products out on the market right now. Right now, the two that we are primarily promoting at our clinics is Simparica Trio and Pro Heart Plus. These seem to be really effective products. The wonderful thing about Pro Heart Plus is, again, it's an injection, so it's a shot. You give it once and you don't even have to remember to give it every 30 days. I know that can be a challenge. You buy the product and then shoot, my time has passed. I forgot to give it to my pet. If you are a couple of days late, though, on a prevention, it's not the end of the world. How a product like Simparica Trio works, which is like a tablet or a chewable that you give them every 30 days, is it actually goes back and kills any microfilaria that are in the bloodstream over the last 30 days. That's why you give it every 30 days. So they're already built in to have a little bit of protection there. The lovely thing about Pro Heart, again, is you give that shot once, and then your dog is protected for that entire year or 6 months. I think 6 months is, if they're a young dog, they can only get 6 months at a time. If they're an adult dog over a year, they can get that yearly shot, which is really nice. HeartGuard is also a every 30 day chewable. That is still a product that's widely used and recommended on the market. Other ways we can prevent is reduce exposure to mosquitoes. So, if your dog is out long periods of time unsupervised in the yard and they're not on prevention, they're probably the highest risk, right? Especially in the summer months or warm months when mosquitoes are going to be breeding and out in the community. How do we control mosquito population? We can even do a little bit of this in our own yard, is make sure if we have any standing water, so like if we have a bucket or some kids' toys or things that just might be around, or even on the shelter grounds, if you notice a dog bowl has been left out with water for a couple of days, that's not good. That's how mosquitoes breed. They actually land in that standing water, they lay their eggs, and then they have a super quick reproductive cycle. Those babies are hatched very quickly, and then they're little wiggly worms in the water, and then they become adults, and then they're flying around and they're potentially spreading heartworm. So even the shelter could be a place, we think dogs are inside, they're safe. Not necessarily. I've definitely even seen mosquitoes flying around inside the shelter before. If I see them, I don't know, maybe I'm a little neurotic about it. I'm chasing them down and I'm trying to squish them because I definitely don't want to put any of our babies at risk. The other thing we can do is pest control. So there are some products that you can spray around, like mosquito defoggers. Depending on where you live, you may or may not want to do that. A city might be a little intense, but if you're out and living where there's a lot of property and you're right out on top of your neighbors, there are mosquito foggers that you can do every so often around your property that will actually prevent the mosquitoes from coming around. My family has property up near Higgins Lake. We're in the woods. There are really heavy mosquitoes most of the time that we're up there, because obviously we visit the cabin a lot during the warmer months. So we always fog when we go out because we bring up our dogs. We're all out there. Even when we're spraying with bug spray, we have to respray very often because they're around and they will eventually say, I don't care if you're wearing bug spray, they're still going to bite. So that's another way you can do it. And you can also put good bugs out into the community so that will eat mosquitoes. So dragonflies, we want to keep those guys around. So if you ever see those, don't get freaked out. They're actually, like ladybugs, do some good work in our community with keeping down and managing that mosquito population, which could be potentially that carrier of the heartworm disease. The other thing that's really important that we can do to protect our dogs is routine testing and catching the disease early. So this is why if you are fostering a pet with us, you'll see that they are due for a heartworm test. I think it's every 6 months to a year. That's because we want to keep checking just in case. We don't know when that animal came to us before, if they were on a regular prevention. And even though they might test heartworm negative now, it doesn't mean that they can't be harboring something in their bloodstream. So that's why we do that routine testing. The other cool thing that we do is we make sure all of the shelter dogs are on prevention while they're in our care, because we want to make sure those babies are protected as much as possible while they're with us, and then again when they go out into their home. So that's another thing you want to do with your pet. Even if they're healthy, usually a yearly visit for dogs is recommended, because that's how often you're going to test your dog to make sure that they are heartworm negative and they don't need other interventions. And that's when you're going to up your prescription for your preventative. So whether that's Simparica Trio or Pro Heart or HeartGuard. So medication versus prevention. Bear with me, guys. This might be where it gets a little tricky for me. So prevention. So for monthly, actually I talked about this a little bit already. So there are monthly preventions. So that's Empirica Trio and HeartGuard. So these do cost a little bit more dollars and they are a little bit more time consuming. So again, you have to remember to give them every 30 days. Like I said, there's a little bit of a buffer in there, but if you forget 2 months in a row, you could potentially be opening up a dog to be at risk for heartworm. Because again, we're not going to see symptoms. We don't know if microfilaria are in their bloodstream. And if we're only testing our dog every 6 months to a year, we could potentially be missing an infestation. So when we get to the part where we need to treat a dog, again, that's really when it gets expensive. No longer are we paying a monthly fee. We're actually going to need to start making sure we're knocking out any of those adult worms before they do any significant damage to our dog's heart. So how that works, and this is specifically what we do in the shelter when we're treating, the first step is staging a dog. We want to find out how severe the disease is. If it's caught very early on, the likelihood of treatment being successful and the dog responding to treatment is very high. So we're hoping that a dog is in the earliest stages. Stage 1 and 2 is what we treat in the shelter. Further along staging, like stage 3 or 4, that's when there's a very significant infection going on, and the likelihood that treatment is successful goes down quite a bit. I can't give you the exact percentage, but now we're starting to talk about it being dangerous for the animal. Again, the drug that we use to treat heartworm disease is very powerful, and if a dog is already weak and struggling from the disease, it's possible that when we start the treatment, that could actually make them even more weak and potentially cause the treatment to be fatal for them. So that's why we stage, because we want to make sure the dog is actually healthy enough to go under treatment. And if not, what other steps do we need to do to take to make sure they're going to be okay? So that's the exact same process an owner would take too with their own veterinarian. Next part is once we've decided that the dog has heartworm and what stage they are in, we start them on a steroid. And the reason for this is because we're reducing any of the clinical signs. So if there's like swelling or damage that's happening in the heart, or, again, they're having that abnormality in their tummy area, this is going to start helping the dog feel a little bit better before we start that really heavy hitter. So steroids and antibiotics go along together. Those would both be started before we would do an injection. So that's the next step, which is the heartworm adulticide, which is what's actually going to start working to actually kill the adult worms there. So the treatment program that we use here at Michigan Humane is 3 injections. And there's 30 days in between the first and second injection. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that the animal is doing well and the treatment is looking successful then. Again, those injections are really tough on the dog's body. So you don't want to boom, boom, boom. We need to slowly kill off those adult worms, because what happens is we give them an injection. Again, that's what they're doing. They're tackling those big adult worms. They're making sure that they're making those worms sick, if you will, and starting to have them pass slowly through parts of the heart, and then eventually they just deteriorate in the body. But if you kill them all at once, that big old glob that we saw in the picture in that first slide, that could cause complications for the dog. It could actually block an artery. It could clog a part of the heart or the lung. That's a lot of times when sudden death can happen for a dog. So that's why it's really important that they have that strict cage rest. That's the last bullet there. Because that treatment is really, it's starting to kill those worms, and we don't want that activity that so we say when people are do a leash walk only, low activity, no running or jogging, they don't have to be perfectly still and only sleeping in a cage. But if their heart really gets pumping and moving those worms around, again, that can cause sudden death too, because it potentially is breaking off a big piece of those worms that are starting to get sick and die. And again, cause a blockage, cardiac arrest, if you will. So we don't want to do that. That's why cage rest is really important. So prevention is definitely not the same as treatment. Prevention is stopping before we get to all this really serious stuff. Treatment is, we can't do any of the little stuff anymore. We have to go in with the big heavy hitters. So how can volunteers help? So in the shelter, kind of briefly touched on this already, but we definitely want to reduce activity for any dogs if they're going through heartworm treatment currently. So you might see the little red hearts on their cages, or they might have a little sign that says I'm being treated for heartworm. If you see that, they're still able to socialize with volunteers, but they can only have time on leash. So they can't go into the play yards and run around. We shouldn't be encouraging them to jump up or play fetch. We want to keep their heart rate low while they're under the treatment because we don't want to cause them to work their heart to work too hard and have any difficulties while they're going through their treatment. Because remember that treatment is a long time. It's 6 months that we're monitoring them even after they have those injections. And those injections are 30 days apart. If you see any, sorry, one second. If you see any suspicious symptoms, so any of the clinical signs like we talked about, like extensive coughing, really abnormal fatigue. So say you've been coming to the shelter regularly and a dog that's normally really active, they just don't seem themselves. They seem depressed. They're laying around a lot. Those are things that we want to report. Also, too, the day of a dog receiving an injection, they can feel really crappy. It takes a lot out of them. So they may not even want to come and interact with us. They might just want to rest in their cage. If that's the case, that's really important that we give them that space. I mean, I hear that it's like they feel beat up after they get that injection, some of them. So giving them a little time to recuperate is important too. Make sure they're up to date on their heartworm prevention. So that's not something really volunteers will have to do. Our shelter med team does a really good job of running a regular basis to make sure that if animals are due for heartworm prevention, flea treatments, their next vaccine booster, any dewormers, that they're taking care of that. And what you can do though is if you ever see a little tray with food and a pill in it and the dog hasn't eaten it, to make sure you report that to staff and don't just throw that pill away. We're not asking you to help encourage the dogs to eat it, but make sure you report that to a staff member so they can ensure that that animal gets their medication. Because some dogs they don't like to eat their meds. So that's another way we can protect them. And you might be talking to an adopter and you're working with a heartworm dog and they say, "What's this?" Well, now you have a little bit more information about heartworm. We don't necessarily want to scare people, but we do want to educate them. It's really important to treat dogs for heartworm. Otherwise, they get this disease where adult worms grow in their heart. It's like spaghetti. It can cause serious complications, even death, and it's so easy to prevent. So this is what's going on with this dog. She's going through this treatment. She's probably going to recover and be very healthy, but this is why we have to only leash walk her, do things like this. What does it mean for an adopter too if they want to take a a dog that's on a heartworm treatment home? Michigan Humane is still going to cover the rest of the treatment for that dog, but it does mean that they're probably going to have to keep that dog on cage rest for the rest of 6 months and then get that dog retested. So again, you don't have to remember all that, but it's definitely worth encouraging them to make sure they think about it, talk with their own veterinarian, and talk to our staff at the front desk for more information. How can we help at home? Regular prevention for your dog. That's the easiest thing. And going in for your regular heartworm testing. Again, you can talk to your DVM about what their recommendations are and what their preferred product is. Right now, we're really promoting ProHeart Plus because it's so easy. It's just that injection one time, and then you don't even have to think about it, and your dog is protected for the entire year. And then they just come back for their yearly checkup. They get their heartworm test. They make sure that they're good, and they get back on their prevention again. And you can also do any of those other things that we talked about, making sure you're not overstanding water, treat your home for mosquitoes. There's even some other naturals in there like citronella. You can purchase a plant and have that growing in your yard. Lemon bulb is another natural plant that you can grow that deters mosquitoes away. Catnip and cat mint, both are mosquito deterrents that weren't mentioned on the other slide. So those are really cool. And if you have cats at home, they have a tasty treat. So, or you can bring them into the shelter and we can use it for the kitties there. Nothing like some fresh catnip. But those are other ways that you can deter mosquitoes from coming around your property. And then for our fosters, make sure you're following up to get your dog in for their prevention and their testing. I know it can be really easy to say, is it that big deal if I wait a couple of weeks? Um, it could be. So if you know that they are due to get their stuff, make sure you reach out to the foster department and set up that appointment. So we should be quick and easy, 30-40 minute appointment just to get them they need, can talk to a staff member and make sure the dogs are staying healthy. And definitely report any clinical signs. So again, if you're noticing coughing, if you're noticing that they're laying around a lot and don't seem their normal self, those are all things that you can report to the shelter staff when you're bringing them for their appointment. Maybe they aren't due for a heartworm test, but they want to test them sooner just to check and make sure. That's something we can do. We always rather know more information than less information so we can accurately diagnose an animal. So last, you guys are probably pretty familiar with this slide. It takes a community. We are so grateful for all that you do, whether you're on site, taking care of animals in your home with their fosters or your own pets. It really does take a group effort to make sure our dogs are protected from this deadly virus. We definitely don't want to make people feel ashamed if they don't know what heartworm is, but we can definitely start having conversations about this and how easy it can be to save a dog's life. And even though it does seem expensive, it really is going to be so much cheaper to do prevention versus waiting for treatment that we might not even catch until it's too late.
I just want to jump in real quick and add something that I've noticed a lot of our volunteers do, which I appreciate, and I would just like to thank our volunteers for. I've heard you guys out on the adoption floor. A lot of our heartworm dogs can stay with us longer because of the situation that they're in. And people can often think that, like we talked about, that the things are able to pass from dog to dog or something like that. And it scares people, especially if they have their own animal at home. And that's where that education piece comes in. So I've heard volunteers out on the floor talking about, this is my favorite dog. She's actually super calm if you're looking for a calm dog because she's got heartworm. So she kind of is a little more chill or, anything about them and just talking them up to people so that you can have that conversation of maybe telling them what heartworm actually is about. Maybe they think the dog is super cute, but they're afraid to take them home to their own dog because they don't know this information. So I've heard a lot of that coming from our volunteers. So if you've done that for any of our animals, not just for heartworm, just for anything, we really appreciate that because we don't get that opportunity very often to be on those adoption floors and share those things with people who are looking at them.
And I'll just add to that, I think it's a common misconception too, like we talked about in the myth section, is people, if they see a dog as heartworm positive, they're worried that they can't be interested in this dog because they're going to take it home and it's going to affect their current pets. And that's not true. And we've done a lot of work in the organization to make heartworm dogs as easy to adopt. User-friendly for adopters, if you will, by covering a lot of that treatment once they go home. So everything is through us. All they have to do is set up the appointments, and we cover everything. So it's really just keeping an eye on their animal and make sure things are going well. And any one of our customer service staff can talk more about it. It doesn't have to be a big, scary thing. It's definitely something to consider, but it's not going to necessarily be a lifelong thing that this dog is never going to have heartworm or they are going to go home and they're going to be sick and they'll never be a normal dog. Many of these dogs recover. That's why we do that staging. When they're in stage 1 or 2, it's like 80-90% recovery rate. So really, really high. The dogs do very well. So with that, we will go ahead and open it up to questions. You guys can either drop questions in the chat or if you want to raise your hand. So how you can do that is if you scroll down to the upper bottom and hit the more button, there's a thing that says reactions. And when you click reactions, there's a raise hand button. You can put it there. But yeah, we'd love to have your questions. Take them if you have them.
We do have one in the chat. What is the actual heartworm test? Is it a blood test, stool test? What does that look like?
That's a good question. So we do a snap test and a direct test for heartworm. It's a blood test, and a snap test is basically when we do a blood draw and we have a little well, it's a sample, little kit, and you drop a certain number of drops of blood into it and you snap it down, and then it's almost like a COVID test, right? You put your little things in there, and then after so much time, and there's a control, it runs, it tells you if the test worked, and it'll tell you if a dog is positive, negative. So that's the first thing we do. If we get a positive, then we also run a direct, and that's where we put a couple of drops of blood on an actual slide and read that under a microscope, and we look for the microfilaria. So sometimes you can't see microfilaria because, again, they can be hard to find depending on what stage. Say all those microfilaria turns into adults, you're not going to see anything on the slide. That's why we do a snap test first. You cannot test for heartworm any other way than through blood, because it is a parasite that lives in the bloodstream in the heart. The only other way to test for adults would be like, right, opening them up for surgery, which we're not going to do. That's not the way you test for it. So it's a really good question. Thanks for asking that, Mike.
Hey, any other questions?
Any other questions?
Give you guys just a minute. And to feel free to ask any of them if you think it might be something for Dr. Kim, because we're going to record this and we will take those questions back to him too. So if you don't think we can answer it, if it's a little more in depth, please either put those here or email one of us, and we'd be happy to take those to him.
So one other thing while we're waiting to see if other people have questions that I like to talk about that comes up is for people working with the dogs either in their foster home, because like some dogs that are getting heartworm treatment could be needing foster, or if you're working with a dog on site is, oh my gosh, this dog is so energetic, I can't keep them calm, and they're getting treated for heartworm. What the heck do I do? They won't sit, they won't lay. Like this cage rest thing is a nightmare that comes up because some of our dogs too in the shelter, they are not relaxing and they're bouncing off the walls, right? And they're being treated for heartworm. And you're like, please just stop. We don't want anything bad to happen to you. So one day I asked one of our DVMs, Dr. Garrett, and I was like, can you tell me this? Because I'm worried a dog's just going to drop dead in our kennel. And I mean, maybe this is a irrational fear, but they won't stop. And she said, a dog can be a normal dog. We can't expect them to just lay those whole 6 weeks, 6 months while they're on cage rest. That's unrealistic. All we can do is try to minimize their activity as best as we can. No vigorous exercise. So we don't want to that's why we don't take them out in the play yard. We don't want to start tossing the ball and having them play fetch. We don't want to encourage them to play tug. We're not going to jog with them on the leash, things of that nature. They can still go for walks. We used to say short leash walk only. That doesn't really matter. I mean, if you want to walk around the property a couple of times and they're just a chill guy sniffing, or even if they're not, but they're not like pulling you down and you're able to, redirect them with treats or toys, they can still go. It's not the length of time they're moving around, it's how much their heart is pumping. So she's like, I remember it was clear we had this little Jack Russell who was just bing, 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 and I was like, what do we do? She's like, we're just going to let that dog be a dog. Probably nothing is going to happen. If we start to see any other symptoms of the dog being unwell, then, we could go further, but we're not going to sedate dogs while they're in care unnecessarily. Like she wasn't doing it. She was just a Jack Russell. They're little active doggies. So hopefully that gives people some peace of mind. You don't have to worry about a dog keeling over, if you're working with it and it has heartworm. If it's being a normal dog, it's gonna be okay, but we don't want to encourage any more vigorous exercise than we need to. Looks like we had another
real quick,
pop up there.
Jen, I'll just add to what you said a little bit too. I highly recommend for anybody who is having like an off day, or maybe they're going through something and walking the dogs is not maybe necessarily what they're hoping to do that day, but they still want to spend time with the dogs. Taking our heartworm dogs just into a room, like into a smaller space, and letting them have time with you is perfect. Because these guys can't do as much, they may not be doing as much, so they would be really appreciative of just hanging out with you. I highly recommend take one of those acquaintance rooms or take one of our offices if it's open, and put a bed down and give them a Kong or something to just hang out with you and have a good time. Take a nap away from all the noise, de-stress a little bit, especially being a heartworm dog. They need that stress-free time as much as possible. So if you're ever man, I just am recovering from being sick and I don't feel like doing a bunch of walking, but I still want to get time with my dogs, that is a great way to do it. Just come in and spend time with the heartworm dogs. They definitely need it. Jen, I can go ahead and read you the next questions in here. So why do humans not get heartworm if they are bitten by an infected mosquito? I don't know the answer to that.
Great question that I'm going to be honest, I don't know the answer to. I would have to think it has to do something with we are not a compatible host for the virus. But I don't actually know for sure. We'll have to save that one for Dr. Kim and share it with the group. Great question.
We will
But
come
I
back to
will
you.
clarify, humans cannot get heartworm.
The next one, are there any dogs that don't qualify for treatment due to a combination of severity of the illness and their age, or maybe other illnesses that they're dealing with too?
Yeah, that's a great question. It can happen. There's definitely been dogs that have come in. They, we've run blood panels on them, not only just to check for the disease, but to see like what their overall wellness is. And they're not in good shape. They could, maybe have cancer and heartworm and they're 10 years old, things like that are going to be a dog that wouldn't be a candidate for treatment. So it is a sad truth that sometimes that does happen. Again, stage 3 and 4, those are usually ones that the shelter isn't treating because the disease has so far progressed that the dog is not going to respond well to treatment. It's going to be super painful for the dog. They're probably going to die during treatment. So I know that that's really hard to say, but in those moments, the most humane thing that we can do for them is to ease their suffering. Again, you saw that stage 4, those really intense symptoms were constant fatigue, constant coughing, really distended belly. The dogs aren't feeling very well at that point. So it's sad, but it definitely can happen. Any dogs that you see that are treated for heartworm on our floor, those are going to be stage 1 and 2. Those are usually caught very early. Successive treatment is very, very high. They're going to live normal, happy lives afterwards. 3 is probably one of those ones that are on the line and up to a DVM's discretion and versus other things that are going on with that dog, either medically or behaviorally. So great question, Mike. Thank you again.
And just
Anybody
one
else?
Oh, I'm so sorry,
Oh, go
Jen.
ahead.
Keep
No, go
talking
ahead,
like at the
Ashley.
same time as you. And one more thing that I think is just nice to kind of keep in our brains about that whole situation. Of course, it's never fun if we have to make a difficult decision for any animals in our care. But definitely if they're struggling with something like this, I know one of the things that I just like to think about is that they're here with us, where we can make that determination for them. We have the opportunity to do that for them, versus being astray and just struggling on their own and not having that grace to be supported at the end of whatever they're dealing with. So as much as it's painful and as much as it's horrible, at the very least, I think it's a better option for them to be with us, and we can take that pain away for them if necessary. Our last one here is if you are really good about monthly preventative, are there still advantages to the once a year shot?
It's also a really good question where I'm going to say this is not my area of expertise. ProHeart is actually pretty new within the last, I would say since during the pandemic, a newer product. I mean, that's not to say that it isn't a good product. It's very well tested, and a lot of veterinarians are recommending it because of the ease and how effective it is. As far as cost wise, that could maybe be something that is a determiner for people. It might be more expensive to get the drug because when you give a shot, you're giving the whole year. So it might be a little bit more expensive than prevention because if you want to just buy month by month, people could do that. So you're only paying 1 month prevented at a time instead of a big chunk of preventative, like 6 months. So that could be a pro or a con for someone, depending, on how much money they have to expend. Some, again, I'm not sure what the heartworm used to have, or I'm sorry, heart guard. We said heartworm so many times right now. Heart guard used to have this really great guarantee that if your dog somehow got heart tested positive for heartworm while they were on prevention with their product, they would pay for your heartworm treatment as long as you gave prevention all 12 months out of the year. I thought that was just a stellar guarantee. HeartGuard Plus also treats against a couple of different worms. So there's also a dewormer component in it, which I personally thought was fantastic and loved, because then every 30 days you're just deworming your pet. I'm assuming Simparica Trio is very similar because it's also a 30-day tablet that you give your pet. Whereas ProHeart, right, if you're giving an injection, I don't know that there's any of those special benefits added along with it. So really the best thing I would say is it's a good conversation to have with your vet. They will talk to you about what probably would work best for you and for your pet based on your finances, based on your lifestyle, based on what preventatives you're looking for your dog. So that would be my best recommendation, is just bring it up. See. Good question though. Thank you, Justin.
I don't think we talked about it. And if you are able to, Jen, I think that it could be beneficial. The importance of cats being carriers and being on their own medication.
Yeah, so I'm going to be honest. I don't feel confident enough in really talking about cats and heartworm. I do know, what very little I do know is that they can contract the disease, but they are not the preferred host. So a mosquito or heartworm would rather live in a dog. Their body, just the composition of it, is more desirable. The likelihood that the microfilaria are going to turn into adults is extremely high in a dog. It's much lower in a cat, but they still can get it. There are cases that cats have gotten it. As far as pros and cons of prevention, again, that's a conversation I'd recommend for a DVM. It's a conversation I had a long time ago with my DVM. He prescribed it to me because my cat spent a little bit of time outdoors. So I was really, worried about it. But he had a long conversation with me first about the pros and cons and, how likely versus how unlikely. So that was what I would encourage people to do. If you have a kitty at home and you want to make sure you're doing the right thing for them, is just talk to your DVM about it. I doubt it's a thing they probably bring up with a lot of cat owners, because most people are probably like, no, I'm not going to spend the extra money on it. But I think a vet would be thrilled if you brought up the question, and would be happy to talk to you further about if it's a good idea for your cat to be on it or not, and what the risks are. Obviously, if you have a cat that's spending time outside, or they are an outdoor cat, the risk is probably higher versus indoors. Doesn't mean an indoor cat can't get it. Just like we talked about dogs, indoor dogs can still get heartworm. So the risk isn't zero, but obviously it's a lot higher if they are constantly outside. And again, in Michigan, mosquitoes are they're around more months of the year than they are not. So.
Hey, any other questions? These were great questions, guys. This is awesome. And like I said, we will take kind of these ones that we don't have the full answers to. We will make sure that we get to our DVM and get you guys some answers with your follow-up email.
I just want to say also thank you, Ashley, for bringing up the part about heartworm dogs spending time in a visiting room. And that's a good point for our fosters out there. We say cage rest for your heartworm fosters if you do. I know a lot of them now, we don't need foster homes as much anymore because we put them up for adoption, which is the reason why we do that, because we don't like to tie up a foster home for 6 months with a heartworm dog. It's not good. When we could potentially move them through and find them a loving home sooner. But they don't have to be in the cage all the time. Again, we're just trying to reduce that activity. So if you have a dog that just wants to lay around, or they need to come out and just chew on a chewy, like Ashley said, they can still be a normal dog. We don't want to seclude them in a room, because that leads to other issues, right? And I think that's why some of our heartworm dogs at the shelter get really rambunctious, is because they're bored. They're bored from spending more time in the kennel and not being able to go off leash. So it really is a good idea to spend time with them in a visiting room, if it seems safe to do so. And what I mean by that is sometimes they're so rambunctious that you can't get them to settle with a rawhide or a stuffy, and just squeaking on the floor. If that's the case, then it probably is best to leave them in their cage so they can, not people won't be around them and they can hopefully settle. You can still give them a Kong or a Chewy in their cage. But yeah, that was a really great point to bring up. So thank you.
For sure. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. We are at the end of our presentation here. We apologize again for not having Dr. Kim, but veterinary work is, you never know what's going to come up. And I'm sure something came up. So thank you very much for joining us. We will have a follow-up email for everybody with links and information, as well as the recording. And if there is anything else that you need, please send us an email. But you guys have a great rest of your day.
Bye, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you all. Hope you found this informative.